I was in the basement when Preston tried to brand me with a sizzling hot metal school crest. 6 months later at graduation, he was begging me not to mention his name in my valedictorian speech. The fire alarm saved my life that night, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 13 when my parents shipped me off to Thornwick Academy, an elite Swiss boarding school. They called it an opportunity. I called it exile. After years of neglect and emotional abuse, being surrounded by entitled rich kids seemed like just another form of punishment, but at least I was away from them. Thornwick was everything you'd expect from a school that cost more than most people's houses. Stone buildings that looked like castles, manicured grounds, and students who owned more in their dorm rooms than my family had in our entire house. I was a scholarship kid in a world of trust funds, and everyone knew it. The first few months were brutal. I ate alone, studied alone, and tried to make myself invisible. The other scholarship students had learned to keep their heads down and blend in, but blending in wasn't my strength. That's when I met Randy. Randy was different. He'd arrived halfway through the semester with a beat-up backpack and clothes that had clearly been bought at thrift stores. While I'd managed to scrape together enough decent clothes to almost fit in, Randy stood out like a neon sign in a cemetery. The treatment he received was unlike anything I'd witnessed. Students would accidentally spill food on his clothes, knowing he couldn't afford to replace them. Teachers would single him out in class, making him answer questions they knew he couldn't answer properly due to his accent. But Randy never fought back. Instead, he was kind. When his mother sent homemade cookies, he shared them with everyone, including the kids who tormented him. When he found money on the ground, he'd ask around to see who had lost it. It was like watching someone feed sharks while standing in bloody water. I wanted to help him, but I was still trying to survive myself. I'd clawed my way into a small group of friends who accepted me as long as I didn't make waves. So when Randy sat alone in the dining hall, I stayed with my group and told myself it wasn't my problem. Legacy Week changed everything. For those who don't know, Legacy Week is a Thornwick tradition where students whose parents attended the school get to initiate those whose parents didn't. It's supposedly about building character and school spirit. In reality, it's a week of sanctioned bullying. I thought I could avoid it by staying in the library and keeping my head down. I was wrong. I was walking back to my dorm at 11 p.m. when 3 Legacy students cornered me in the basement. Preston Blackwell stepped out of the shadows holding the metal school crest like he'd done this before. Preston was everything I hated about Thornwick. Arrogant, cruel, and protected by his family's money. His father had donated an entire building to the school. Preston thought that made him untouchable. Every non-legacy needs to learn their place, he said, flicking his lighter and holding the flame under the metal crest. I watched in horror as it began to glow orange at the edges. Hold him, he told his friends. They grabbed my arms while Preston moved closer with the red-hot metal. I could feel the heat radiating from it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except how much it was going to hurt. That's when the fire alarm went off. The sprinkler system activated immediately, soaking everything. Preston dropped the crest, which hissed against the wet floor. Through the chaos and rushing water, I saw Randy standing by the alarm station, his hand still on the lever. He'd saved me. The next morning, we were called to the headmaster's office. I walked in expecting justice. Instead, the headmaster ignored me completely and focused on Randy. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused? He asked, his voice cold. The basement is flooded. Thousands of dollars in water damage. Randy tried to explain what had been happening, but the headmaster cut him off. This is what happens when we let people like you in, he said. You can take the kid out of the gutter, but you can't take the gutter out of the kid. One more incident and you're out. I was dismissed without anyone asking what had happened to me. Randy left with his shoulders slumped, defeated. Outside the office, Preston was waiting with his friends. He whispered something to Randy that made him go rigid, then walked away laughing. Randy wouldn't tell me what he'd said, just hurried off alone. 2 weeks later, Randy was expelled. Campus security found marijuana in his desk drawer during a random search. No investigation, no questions asked. Randy was gone by noon. I found him that evening behind the dorms, packing his belongings into a garbage bag. He was crying. This kid who had stayed kind through everything was finally broken. You're the only one who ever tried to be decent to me here, he said, wiping his eyes. You deserve to know why this matters so much. He pulled out a photo from his wallet. A man in surgical scrubs standing in front of a hospital. My dad was a surgeon in Syria, Randy explained. My little sister has leukemia. Here we can barely afford her treatment. I was supposed to save her. He stood up, shouldering his bag. Preston knew all this. That's what he whispered to me, that my sister would die before I could ever help her. I watched Randy's taxi disappear into the Swiss mountains and felt something change inside me. The anger I'd been suppressing for months finally broke free. I spent the next week documenting everything I could about Preston's behavior. I recorded conversations where he bragged about getting rid of undesirable students. I gathered witness statements from other victims. I compiled evidence of a systematic campaign of bullying that went far beyond Legacy Week. But when I tried to present it to the administration, I hit a wall. Preston's family had donated millions to the school. His father sat on the board of trustees. My evidence was dismissed as the bitter complaints of a jealous scholarship student. That's when I realized I needed a different approach. Instead of trying to work within the system, I decided to use the system against itself. I started studying Preston's patterns, learning his weaknesses, and building alliances with other other students who had been hurt by his behavior. It turned out there were more of us than I'd thought. Sarah Chen had been Preston's target the year before. Marcus Williams had lost his scholarship recommendation because Preston's father had made a phone call. Emma Rodriguez had been humiliated during Legacy Week, but had been too afraid to speak up. Together, we formed a group dedicated to documenting Preston's behavior and protecting future victims. We called ourselves the Thornwick Truth Network. We started small, anonymous notes warning new students about Preston, recordings of his cruel comments shared through encrypted channels, evidence packages delivered to journalists who covered elite school scandals. But Preston was smart. He realized what was happening and escalated his tactics. He tried to get me expelled by planting stolen property in my room. When that failed, he spread rumors that I was having an inappropriate relationship with a teacher. He even tried to hack my email account to find compromising information. Each attempt made me more determined. The breakthrough came when I discovered Preston kept a journal, not a diary, but a tactical guide. He documented every student he'd targeted, their weaknesses, and his methods for destroying them. He treated psychological warfare like a hobby. Getting access to that journal required months of planning. I had to befriend his roommate, gain his trust, and wait for the perfect opportunity. When Preston left for a family vacation, I had 15 minutes to photograph every page. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Preston hadn't just targeted scholarship students. He'd systematically destroyed anyone who threatened his position as the unofficial king of Thornwick. The journal contained plans to eliminate academic rivals, social competitors, and anyone who dared to challenge him. Randy wasn't his first victim. He wasn't even his 10th. Armed with this evidence, I made my move. But instead of going to the administration again, I went directly to the press. An investigative journalist from The Guardian had been looking into elite school abuse scandals. Preston's journal was exactly what she needed. The story broke 3 days before graduation. Heir to banking fortune runs systematic bullying operation at elite Swiss school was the headline that destroyed Preston's life. Within hours, the story had gone viral. News crews surrounded the school. Parents demanded answers. The board of trustees called emergency meetings. Preston tried to deny everything, but his own handwriting was damning evidence. The journal entries were so detailed, so callous, that no amount of family money could spin them as anything other than the calculations of a sadistic bully. As valedictorian, I was scheduled to give a speech at graduation. Preston approached me the morning of the ceremony, looking haggard and desperate. "Please," he begged, "don't mention my name in your speech. My family's reputation is already destroyed. I'll do anything you want." I looked at him for a long moment. This was the same person who had tried to brand me with hot metal, who had destroyed Randy's dreams, who had tormented dozens of students for his own amusement. "You're right," I said finally. "I won't mention your name." His relief was visible. "But I will mention Randy's," I continued, "and Sarah's and Marcus's and Emma's and every other student you hurt. I'll make sure everyone remembers them." Preston's face crumpled. During my speech, I talked about courage, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, about the responsibility we all had to protect the vulnerable. I didn't mention Preston by name, but everyone knew who I was talking about. The silence in the audience when I described the branding incident was deafening. Preston left Thornwick in disgrace. No university would accept him after the scandal. His family's social standing was permanently damaged. He became a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked privilege and cruelty. But the real victory wasn't Preston's downfall. It was what happened after. Randy was invited to return to Thornwick with a full scholarship and a formal apology from the administration. The school implemented new anti-bullying policies and anonymous reporting systems. Legacy Week was abolished entirely. Most importantly, future scholarship students would never have to endure what Randy and I had experienced. I went on to Oxford on a full scholarship, studying international law with a focus on institutional reform. Randy returned to finish his education and was accepted to Harvard Medical School. His sister's cancer went into remission, and she's now thriving. Sarah, Marcus, and Emma all found their voices and became advocates for student rights. The Thornwick Truth Network evolved into a support system for victims of institutional bullying at elite schools around the world. Preston's journal became evidence in a class action lawsuit against Thornwick. The school paid millions in settlements to his victims and was forced to undergo a complete cultural overhaul. 5 years later, I returned to Thornwick as a guest speaker. The school was unrecognizable. Students from all backgrounds mixed freely. The toxic hierarchy that had defined my experience was gone. During my visit, I met with current students who were part of the reformed student government. They told me about the Randy Coleman Scholarship Fund, established to support students from refugee families. They showed me the memorial garden dedicated to all the students who had been driven away by bullying. They had no idea that the quiet boy they honored had once saved my life by pulling a fire alarm. That night, I received a message from Randy. He was in his final year of medical school, engaged to a wonderful woman who shared his passion for helping others. His sister was cancer-free and planning to study medicine herself. "Thank you," his message said, "for fighting when I couldn't, for making sure our pain meant something." I realized then that the real lesson of Thornwick wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the power of speaking truth to power, of refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged, and of building systems that protect the vulnerable. Preston had tried to brand me as less than human. Instead, he had forged me into someone who would spend their life ensuring no one else would face what we had endured. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's building a world where their kind of evil can't survive. But the story didn't end with graduation. 3 years later, I received a call that brought everything rushing back. It was from Detective Sarah Morrison with the Swiss Federal Police. Preston Blackwell had been arrested on charges of sexual assault and human trafficking. The investigation had uncovered a network of wealthy young men who had been exploiting vulnerable women across Europe. "We found your name in our investigation," Detective Morrison explained. "Several victims mentioned that someone had warned them about Preston's behavior through anonymous messages. Was that you?" I had been tracking Preston's movements since graduation, not out of obsession, but out of concern for future victims. When I'd learned he was frequenting certain clubs and targeting vulnerable women, I'd started sending anonymous warnings to potential victims through social media. "We'd like you to testify about Preston's history of predatory behavior," the detective continued. "Your documentation from Thornwick could be crucial evidence of his pattern of targeting and manipulating vulnerable people." The trial took place 18 months later. I flew to Zurich to testify, bringing with me copies of Preston's journal and documentation of his systematic bullying campaigns. Seeing Preston in the defendant's dock was surreal. He'd aged badly, his once confident demeanor replaced by the paranoid anxiety of someone whose world had completely collapsed. When I took the stand, he wouldn't meet my eyes. I testified about the branding incident, about Randy's expulsion, about the systematic targeting of vulnerable students. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish Preston's long history of predatory behavior and abuse of power. But I wasn't the only Thornwick alumnus who testified. Sarah Chen had become a successful lawyer and spoke about how Preston's psychological abuse had affected her academic performance and mental health. Marcus Williams, now a teacher himself, described how Preston's interference had nearly derailed his education. Most powerfully, Randy testified via video link from Boston, where he was completing his medical residency. He spoke calmly about the trauma of being targeted and expelled, about watching his sister suffer while he was powerless to help her, about the long journey to rebuild his life. "Preston Blackwell didn't just try to destroy my education," Randy said, his voice steady. "He tried to destroy my family's hope for the future. The fact that we survived and thrived despite his cruelty doesn't excuse what he did." The evidence against Preston was overwhelming. Beyond the Thornwick testimonies, prosecutors had documented his escalating criminal behavior over several years. What had started as psychological bullying in school had evolved into serious felonies. Preston was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His family's assets were frozen to pay restitution to his victims. The Blackwell name, once synonymous with Swiss banking power, became a cautionary tale about generational entitlement and abuse, but the trial revealed something even more disturbing. Preston hadn't been acting alone. The network he'd joined included several other alumni from elite schools across Europe, young men who had learned early that wealth and connections could shield them from consequences. An international investigation was launched into what media dubbed the elite school to criminal network pipeline. It uncovered systematic abuse at dozens of prestigious institutions, where cultures of entitlement and impunity had created perfect breeding grounds for future criminals. I was asked to consult on the broader investigation, helping authorities understand how institutional bullying evolved into criminal behavior. My work led to reforms at elite schools across 3 countries and the establishment of new international standards for preventing institutional abuse. The Thornwick Truth Network, which had started as a small group of traumatized students, became a formal organization with funding from several foundations. We developed programs to help institutional abuse survivors and worked with schools to implement prevention systems. Randy completed his medical training and established a clinic providing free care to refugee families. Sarah became a prosecutor specializing in institutional abuse cases. Marcus developed anti-bullying curricula that were adopted by schools worldwide. Emma Rodriguez had perhaps the most interesting journey. She became an investigative journalist and wrote a book about our experience called The Brand: How Elite Schools Create Monsters. It became an international bestseller and sparked a global conversation about privilege, power, and accountability. The book tour brought us all together for the first time since graduation. We met at a small cafe in London, 5 adults who had been shaped by our shared trauma, but had chosen to transform it into purpose. "Do you ever regret fighting back?" Emma asked during our reunion. I thought about it carefully. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that institutions designed to educate were instead breeding cruelty, but I don't regret standing up to it." Randy nodded. "If we hadn't fought, how many more students would have suffered? How many more victims would Preston have claimed?" Sarah shared an update that shocked us all. Preston had recently been attacked in prison by other inmates who had learned about his crimes against women. He was in protective custody, isolated and reportedly struggling with severe depression. "Part of me feels sorry for him," Sarah admitted. "He was probably a victim of the same toxic system that created him." "That's what makes you a better person than he ever was," Marcus replied. "You can feel empathy for someone who showed none to others." We talked talked about our current lives, our families, our ongoing work to prevent institutional abuse. All of us had been shaped by our Thornwick experience, but none of us had been defined by it. As we prepared to leave, Randy pulled out his phone and showed us a photo. A young girl in a hospital bed, smiling despite the medical equipment around her. His sister, Amira, was now healthy and planning to start university in the fall. She wants to study law, Randy said, grinning. Says she wants to help other families fight for justice. I felt a profound sense of completion. The little girl whose life had been threatened by Preston's cruelty was now preparing to become an advocate for others. The circle was closing in the most beautiful way possible. 6 months after our London reunion, I received news that would bring our story full circle. Preston had died in prison, reportedly by suicide, though some inmates claimed he'd been murdered by other prisoners who despised his crimes. I felt no satisfaction in his death. If anything, it felt like a waste, the final act of someone who had never learned to take responsibility for his actions. At Preston's funeral, which was attended by only his immediate family and a few longtime family friends, I made an unexpected decision. I showed up. Preston's mother saw me and approached, her face streaked with tears. "Why are you here?" she asked, not with hostility but with genuine confusion. "Because someone should acknowledge what he could have been," I said. "Your son had every advantage in life. He chose to use them to hurt people, but he still had the capacity to change, to make amends. I'm sorry he never found that path." She broke down completely then, sobbing about how they'd failed as parents, how they'd enabled his worst impulses, how they'd valued reputation over character. I didn't comfort her, but I didn't walk away either. Sometimes bearing witness to someone's pain is the most human thing you can do. The Thornwick scandal eventually led to my appointment as an advisor to the International Commission on Educational Standards. My work focused on preventing institutional cultures that enabled abuse and creating accountability systems that protected vulnerable students. 10 years after graduation, I returned to Thornwick again, this time as a member of the Board of Trustees. The school had asked me to help oversee their ongoing reforms and ensure that the changes implemented after the scandal were permanent. Walking through those halls again, I was struck by how different the atmosphere felt. Students from diverse backgrounds mixed freely. The rigid hierarchy that had defined my experience was gone. In its place was something that actually resembled the educational community Thornwick had always claimed to be. I visited Randy's memorial garden, not because he had died, but because the school had created it to honor all the students whose voices had been silenced by institutional bullying. His name was there, along with dozens of others, a permanent reminder that every student's dignity mattered. During my board meeting, we reviewed the school's annual report on inclusion and student well-being. Bullying incidents were down 90% from my era. Student satisfaction scores were at historic highs. Academic performance had actually improved as students spent less energy navigating social hierarchies and more time learning. Most importantly, no student had been expelled or forced to leave due to peer harassment in over 5 years. The headmaster who had dismissed Randy's complaints had long since retired in disgrace. His replacement was a woman who had spent her career working with at-risk youth and understood that true leadership meant protecting the vulnerable, not enabling the powerful. After the meeting, I walked to the basement where Preston had tried to brand me. The space had been converted into a student resource center, with comfortable seating, study areas, and prominent displays about student rights and reporting procedures. A plaque on the wall read, "In memory of all students whose voices were silenced by institutional indifference. Your stories matter. Your pain was real. Your courage inspires us to do better." I thought about that terrified 13-year-old who had arrived at Thornwick feeling worthless and powerless. He could never have imagined that his experiences would eventually help transform not just one school, but educational systems around the world. The fire alarm that saved me that night had done more than prevent a physical assault. It had awakened something in me, a refusal to accept injustice, a determination to protect others who couldn't protect themselves, and an understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth. As I prepared to leave Thornwick that day, I received a message from Amira, Randy's sister. She had just graduated from law school and been accepted for a fellowship with the International Criminal Court. "Thank you for fighting for my brother," she wrote, "and thank you for teaching me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the same harm doesn't happen to others." I realized then that this was Preston's true legacy, not the harm he had caused, but the determination of his victims to ensure that no one else would suffer as they had. In trying to destroy us, he had instead created a generation of advocates, educators, and leaders committed to justice. The boy who had tried to brand me as less than human had unknowingly forged me into someone who would spend their life ensuring that every human being's dignity was protected. Sometimes the most profound transformations come from the most painful experiences. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by destroying your enemies, but by building a world where their cruelty cannot flourish. And sometimes a fire alarm pulled by a scared scholarship student can change everything. 20 years have passed since that night in the basement, and I'm writing this from my office at the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization in Paris. As the Director of Global Educational Standards, I oversee policies that protect vulnerable students in institutions worldwide. worldwide. The brass nameplate on my desk reads, Dr. Michael Chen. I took my wife's surname when we married, wanting to distance myself from my abusive family's legacy. But more importantly, I wanted to honor the strength of someone who chose love over convenience. My wife, Dr. Lisa Chen, runs a trauma counseling center that specializes in helping survivors of institutional abuse. We met during a conference on educational reform where she was presenting research on the long-term psychological effects of bullying. When I told her my story, she didn't see me as damaged goods. She saw me as a survivor who had transformed pain into purpose. Our daughter Hope is now 15 and attends a progressive international school in Geneva. She knows the story of why Daddy and Mommy work so hard to protect kids like her. Last month, she started a peer mediation program at her school, saying she wanted to be like Uncle Randy and stand up for people who need help. Randy, Dr. Randolph Coleman now, has become more than a friend. He's family. Our children call him Uncle, and his family calls me the same. The bond forged in that Swiss basement has only grown stronger over the decades. His medical practice has expanded into a network of clinics across 3 countries, providing free healthcare to refugee families. His sister Amira, now a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, recently won a landmark case against officials who had systematically abused children in state care. The ripple effects of our Thornwick experience continue to spread in ways we never imagined. Last month, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from a 17-year-old girl named Marie at a boarding school in France. She'd read Emma's book and recognized similar patterns of abuse at her institution. Dr. Chen, she wrote, I found evidence that wealthy students at my school have been systematically targeting scholarship kids for years. I have recordings, documents, everything, but I'm scared. What if no one believes me? What if they destroy my future like they did to the others? I called Marie that evening. Her voice shook as she described the familiar pattern, the isolation, the planted evidence, the administrative indifference. It was Thornwick all over again, just with different names and faces. Marie, I told her, 20 years ago, I was exactly where you are. Scared, alone, with evidence that seemed too big for anyone to believe. But you're not alone now. We've built a network. Within 48 hours, our organization had connected Marie with legal advocates, media contacts, and a support network of other student whistleblowers. The French Ministry of Education launched an investigation within a week. 3 administrators were suspended, and the school's accreditation was placed under review. Marie's courage sparked investigations at 4 other elite French schools. The scandal dominated headlines for months and led to comprehensive reforms of the French private education system. Stories like Marie's arrive in my office regularly now. Students from prestigious schools around the world reaching out because they've heard that someone will listen, someone will act, someone will believe them. We've documented patterns of institutional abuse on every continent. The methods vary by culture, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Wealthy, powerful students learn early that they can abuse others without consequences, and institutions protect them to preserve their own reputations and funding. Our organization now works with over 300 schools worldwide, helping them identify and eliminate toxic cultures before they can take root. We've trained thousands of administrators, teachers, and students to recognize and report abuse. Most importantly, we've created systems that protect whistleblowers and ensure that reports are investigated thoroughly and transparently. The Thornwick model, as our prevention framework is known, has been adopted by education ministries in 17 countries. It's based on 3 simple principles: transparency in reporting, accountability for all students regardless of background, and support systems for vulnerable populations. But perhaps our most important work happens in the quiet moments: the phone calls with scared students, the meetings with parents who don't know how to help their children, the training sessions where we teach educators to see beyond wealth and privilege to the human dignity of every student. 5 years ago, I was invited to speak at a global summit on educational equity. As I prepared my remarks, I thought about that 13-year-old boy who had arrived at Thornwick feeling worthless and powerless. He could never have imagined that his story would be told before an audience of education ministers, policymakers, and advocates from around the world. He could never have dreamed that his pain would become a catalyst for protecting millions of other children. During my speech, I shared a photo that I keep on my desk. It shows Randy and me at our college graduation, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite everything we'd been through. In the background, you can see other Thornwick survivors: Sarah, Marcus, Emma, all of us together, all of us thriving. This photo represents something powerful, I told the audience. It shows that survivors don't just heal, they lead. They don't just overcome trauma, they prevent it for others. They don't just survive institutional abuse, they transform institutions themselves. The response was overwhelming. Standing ovation aside, the real impact came in the conversations afterward. Education ministers committed to reviewing their policies. School administrators pledged to examine their own cultures. Most importantly, students in the audience approached me to share their own stories, knowing now that their voices mattered. One young man from Kenya told me about corruption at his boarding school, where wealthy students literally bought grades and positions, while scholarship students faced impossible standards. A girl from Singapore described a culture where academic pressure combined with social hierarchy had driven 3 students to suicide attempts. Each story reminded me why this work matters. Each voice proved that institutional abuse thrives in silence and dies in sunlight. The technology revolution has given us new tools to fight old problems. Our organization now operates a secure reporting platform where students can safely document abuse. We use artificial intelligence to identify patterns across schools and regions. We've created virtual support networks that connect isolated students with advocates and allies. But the most powerful technology remains the same one Randy used in that basement 20 years ago. The willingness of one person to speak up when others are in danger. Recently, I had the privilege of meeting with a group of young activists who are working to reform elite schools across Latin America. They called themselves Los Valientes, the brave ones. Their leader, a scholarship student named Carlos, reminded me so much of Randy that it took my breath away. Dr. Chen, Carlos said, we read about what you did at Thornwick. We want to do the same thing here. We want to protect the students who come after us. I looked at these young people, teenagers really, who were willing to risk everything to protect others. They had no powerful families to back them, no wealthy connections to shield them. All they had was courage and a belief that justice was possible. You don't need my permission, I told them. You already have everything you need. You have each other, you have the truth, and you have the moral clarity to know that what's happening is wrong. That's more than enough. 6 months later, Los Valientes had exposed corruption at a dozen schools across 5 countries. Their investigation revealed a network of wealthy families who had been essentially buying admissions, grades, and disciplinary immunity for their children. The scandal led to arrests, resignations, and comprehensive reforms. Carlos wrote to me after their success. You were right, Dr. Chen. We already had everything we needed, but knowing that someone else had walked this path before us, that gave us the courage to take the first step. That's become the most rewarding part of my work. Not the speeches or the awards or the policy changes, important as they are. It's the moment when a scared student realizes they're not alone, that their voice matters, that change is possible. Last year, Thornwick invited me to give the commencement address for their 150th anniversary celebration. Standing at that podium, looking out at a sea of graduates from every background imaginable, I felt a profound sense of completion. The school that had once tried to break me had become a model for inclusive excellence. Students of every economic background, every nationality, every identity sat together as equals. The toxic hierarchies that had defined my experience were not just gone, they were unthinkable. During my speech, I told the story of Randy and the fire alarm one more time, but this time, I focused on what happened after, how one act of courage in a moment of crisis had rippled outward to transform not just one school, but educational systems around the world. You are graduating from an institution that learned to be better, I told them, but your education doesn't end here. Your responsibility to protect others, to speak truth to power, to stand up for justice, that's just beginning. In the audience, I spotted several faces I recognized. Marie, the French student who had exposed abuse at her school, was graduating with honors and planning to study international law. Carlos had been accepted to Oxford on a full scholarship. Dozens of other young activists who had found their voices through our work were beginning their adult lives as advocates and leaders. After the ceremony, Randy joined me for a quiet dinner. We talked about our children, our work, our hopes for the future. As always, we marveled at how far we'd come from those scared boys in the Swiss mountains. Do you think Preston ever understood what he unleashed? Randy asked as we watched the sunset over Lake Geneva. I considered the question carefully. I think Preston understood power, but not responsibility. He understood privilege, but not justice. He never learned that true strength comes from protecting others, not from hurting them. His loss, Randy said simply, and the world's gain. We sat in comfortable silence, 2 men who had been forged by fire and had chosen to become shields for others. In the distance, we could see Thornwick's campus, where new students were arriving for orientation, ready to begin their own journeys of growth and discovery. None of them would face what we had faced. None of them would be branded as less than human because of their background or economic status. The systems we had built, the policies we had championed, the culture we had helped create, all of it existed to ensure that every student could pursue their dreams without fear. As I prepared to leave Switzerland and return to my work in Paris, I received one final reminder of how far our mission had spread. A message from a student in rural Bangladesh, where local authorities had been inspired by the Thornwick model to reform their own educational system. Dr. Chen, the message read, because of the work you and your friends started, my sister can now attend school safely. The wealthy landowners' children can no longer abuse the poor students without consequences. Thank you for showing us that change is possible. I showed the message to Randy, who smiled and shook his head in amazement. From a fire alarm in a basement to educational reform in Bangladesh, he said, who could have imagined? I thought about the answer as I boarded my flight back to Paris. Who could have imagined that 2 scared teenagers, armed with nothing but truth and determination, could change the world? But that's the thing about justice. It It doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't accept limits. It starts with one person refusing to accept cruelty as normal, one voice refusing to be silenced, one act of courage that inspires others to be brave. 20 years ago, Randy pulled a fire alarm to save me from being branded. In doing so, he lit a flame that continues to burn around the world, a flame that illuminates injustice, that guides reformers, that gives hope to the vulnerable and courage to those who would protect them. The boy who tried to brand me thought he was marking me as less than human. Instead, he branded himself as someone who would be remembered for all the wrong reasons, while those he tried to destroy would be remembered for building a more just world. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let cruelty define the future, and working every day to ensure that no child will face what you faced. That's the brand we carry now. Not the mark of victims, but the seal of protectors. And it's a brand we wear with pride.